Because here's the basic problem. It's an idea. You can't kill an idea. The idea is pretty simple. It's we didn't lose the right to equality or to live in Palestine just because we were violently ethnically cleansed from it. That is a very powerful idea. I do not lose my right to live in Palestine just because I'm violently ethnically cleansed from it. I do not lose the right to have freedom of movement and to vote for the country and the government that controls my life just because I was occupied in 1967. No, I didn't lose that right. I still have that right. And I always will have that right. And that is the fundamental problem with Israel's idea that they're going to eradicate violent resistance.
Up like ants in a colony, organize the wealth into a socialist economy. A way of life based off the common needs. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene. And all my comrades is ready, we can spread the scene.
Okay, hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Subversive History. Today we have another interview that we're doing. Today we are extremely grateful to be joined by Zachary Foster, who is a PhD historian, focusing primarily, I would say, on the history of Palestine, Israel-Palestine. I believe his dissertation was on like the history of like the Palestinian identity throughout the years. Zach, if you would, maybe just give us, our audience, a little bit of a introduction to who you are and what you do.
Thanks so much for having me. First of all, I'm a historian of Palestine. I grew up in Detroit. I'm American, spent many years living in the Middle East, in Israel, Palestine, Egypt, Syria, went back to the US, did my PhD on the origins of a Palestinian identity in the late Ottoman period, as well as a history of the idea of Palestine, the word Palestine. When did people use that word in history, in Arabic, in European languages? And so that is my background. That's my research expertise. Over the past couple of years, I've also spent a lot of time trying to reach broader audiences, right? Taking this history that is, behind paywalls, that is in this dense academic prose, oftentimes impenetrable, and trying to repurpose it and repackage it and make it more accessible to broader audiences. And that's also something I've been doing with my newsletter, Palestine in Your Inbox, is trying to take this academic knowledge about Palestine and make it more digestible for broader audiences.
Awesome. That's amazing. And if you've been following the conflict recently, this past, 8-9 months of the Israeli invasion of Gaza and the things that have been going on, you might have noticed Zach has been on the Majority Report. He's been on Owen Jones. He's been on Katie Halper. He's done a number of programs, and you may have heard him speak about his touching on anti-Semitism versus anti-Zionism, on his evolution from, being kind of like coming from a Zionist family to becoming like an anti-Zionist historian. And if you want to hear him talk about that, you can go to more of those programs that I previously discussed. We want to go a little bit different route because this is subversive history. So we really want to get into the nitty-gritty historical topics, and not just the historical topics, but almost like a meta discussion of historiography on the topic. So like the first thing that I just kind of wanted to ask you, and this, I don't know, this might be a little crude, but so I've been very excited to speak with you as a proponent of Palestinian liberation who is non-Jewish. I have always been drawn to Israeli Jewish historians and journalists to gain information on the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Obviously, this most prominently features the iconic Israeli new historians, who would be Ilan Pappé, Avi Shlaim, Benny Morris, and the late Sima Flappin. My first question to you comes not from a place of historic inquisition, but actually just from a book nerd that now has an expert in front of me. How would you personally rank the new Israeli historians' best to worst?
Wow. Should have done my homework before jumping on this subversive history pod. Well,
I've been listening to you. You're being modest. I know you're far, far more qualified to answer these questions. Yeah, I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate that question. I would say each of these historians that you just mentioned have written wonderful books of history. Maybe we can start with Benny Morris. Benny Morris, I would say, is the most he's the most complex of the figures because, on the one hand, his historical works are second to none. I mean, his use of Israeli archival sources is truly unparalleled. I mean, The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, that book was first published, I believe, in the late 80s. There was a second edition published in the early 2000s. we're talking 350 pages of every sentence has a footnote that referencing some document in the Israeli Central Archives in Jerusalem, or the Central Zionist Archives also in Jerusalem. So he has complete mastery over the archival sources, by the way, many of which have, since the publication of his books, been reclassified, right? The Israeli archivists picked up his book and were like, oh my God, he's exposed the myths.
Hey, hang on here a minute. We need to redact some things.
They've literally gone back into his. They've gone into the archives and reclassified not dozens but hundreds and hundreds of documents. This is a story that has been exposed by Shai Haskani. A more recent, you might say, he's kind of in that same vein of historians, Israeli Jewish historians, taking a much more critical approach to the traditional Zionist historiography. And he's documented where cases where he's trying to find he has Benny Morris's book. He sees the source, goes and requests that source in the Central Zionist Archives, and he's told by the Zionist archivist, this is a classified document, even though it had been unclassified already 30 years earlier. But Benny Morris, I would say, there's a few things to say about Benny Morris's work. So on the one hand, we said his research in the archives is second to none. However, he doesn't use any Arabic sources. In fact, he tends to dismiss Palestinian oral history, even though much of that oral history has itself been corroborated by the Israeli archival sources himself.
Here enters Ilan Pape, right? When it comes to the Arab oral history, correct?
That's exactly right. So then you have Ilan Pape, who I would say takes a very different approach than Benny Morris, even though I would say they actually arrive at similar conclusions.
I agree.
Ilan Pape, I would say what differentiates him from Benny Morris is that, I would say he's willing to read between the lines much more so than Benny Morris. Mm-hmm. Benny Morris will say, "Oh, we don't have a smoking gun. We can't say with any certainty that this plan Dalet that
no order for transfer."
Right. Yeah. So the plan Dalet is basically a blueprint for expulsion, right? It's the Zionist forces in the early months of that war, are experiencing some military defeat, right? The Palestinian paramilitary forces in the very early months of the war, we'll call it December, January 1947-48, they are able to actually cut off supply lines. Really? The Zionist supply lines that are basically trying to supply Jerusalem, with supplies, and so as a result of that, the Zionist forces basically come to the decision that Palestinian villages, Palestinian towns within the borders that are eventually going to become this Zionist state, they need to be depopulated. They need to be removed. And that is effectively the result of this plan Dalet. And Ilan Pape describes this as a kind of an ethnic cleansing, whereas Benny Morris doesn't. Benny Morris would say, no, this was, in the heat of war, in the fog of war, these were necessary military decisions, but this wasn't the result of any kind of pre-planned expulsion. So I would say the differences are actually subtle, but they're more so kind of reading between the lines rather than ultimately like what the evidence itself shows. I think the evidence is pretty clear, which is that the Zionist forces adopt this plan which calls for the expulsion of Palestinian towns and villages that are within the borders of the future Zionist state.
Okay.
And then we can mention Avi Shleim. Avi Shleim is another one of the new historians. I believe his book, The Iron Wall, is a quite a remarkable work of history in which he documents, I would say, in case after case after case. I would say that the key finding of that book is that it's the Israeli state and its prime ministers and its cabinets that are intransient and are unwilling to make any kind of peace deals with the Arab states, with Egypt, with Syria, in the aftermath of the 48 war, in the aftermath of the 56 war, in the aftermath of the 67 war, in the aftermath of the 73 war. He really documents Israeli leaders' intransience to peace deals, their total unwillingness to give up the territories that they had illegally occupied in the 1967 war. I would say that's a key contribution of that book. That's why it's called The Iron Wall.
It's a Jabotinsky reference, correct?
That's exactly right. Zev Jabotinsky, this revisionist Zionist, who publishes a tract in the 1920s called The Iron Wall, in which he basically says, look, the native inhabitants of Palestine, they consider themselves the native inhabitants, the indigenous inhabitants. They have no intention of leaving. They're not going to give up their means of livelihood. They're not going to voluntarily leave Palestine. They have strong roots in the country. And in order to build a Jewish state in Palestine, we're going to need to expel them. I mean, that was basically the conclusion that Zev Jabotinsky reached in the 1920s already, and that is the phrase that Avi Shlaim uses as a title of his book. 5 decades later, to describe basically the same attitude of the Israeli leadership, which is these Palestinians. They and he's really referring to the broader Arab states as well, I would say, but that that it's the Israeli state and the Israeli leadership which is totally uninterested in any kind of negotiated or diplomatic solution. It's force is the only way to negotiate.
Did you want to give a brief on Flappin, or do you want to move on to the next question? I'm sorry.
He
passed away I think he passed away in the 80s, right? He only has that one main contribution, that book, Myths and Realities, I believe it's called.
Yeah, it's been probably 15 years since I looked at that book, so maybe I'll
I honestly, we could just cut the interview now, because you touched on so many of the things that I actually have as my next questions. So I hope you don't mind going into those maybe in a little bit more finer detail. Sure. I was like, maybe I shouldn't have asked this question first, because you're spreading a lot of the ground that I meant to bring up. But my next question is regarding Benny Morris, the subject of transfer and the potential of changing of his positions over time that I wanted to ask you about. So my next thing, and this is going to say a lot of the things that you just said, but Benny Morris is an interesting and complex character. On one hand, his early works are foundational in challenging the Orthodox Zionist history of Israel, and his books such as The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem and Israel's Border Wars are indispensable contributions to the history of the conflict. However, following the Second Intifada, Morris went through somewhat of a political transformation. Avi Shlaim himself said something to the effect of him undergoing a brain transplant. Can you give your overall opinion of Morris as a historian and speak to this potential kind of evolution that may have seen him have a little bit of a different interpretation than one would believe from reading his early books?
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, there's history and there's opinion, and history doesn't really care so much about your political opinions. And I would say, and Benny Morris is a perfect example of that, right? Which is to say that he documents the forcible eviction, the forced expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in 1948. Using the Israeli archival sources themselves. At the same time, he'll make the argument that, well, we should the Zionist forces should have expelled all the Palestinians, right? We didn't expel enough Palestinians, and that's his argument, based on this idea that you could say that that if you ethnically cleanse them completely, without leaving a single Palestinian left within the borders of the state of Israel, or perhaps within the borders of historic Palestine, basically a small crime in 1948 is justified by preventing much more pain and much more suffering in the subsequent years and decades to come. Now, I'm not really sure, this is a moral argument. Here we're kind of venturing into the waters and territories of is a small crime, can the means justify the ends? If a small crime is committed now to prevent more and more suffering later on, does that is that justified somehow? I mean, look, now we're kind of venturing into the territory of philosophy and ethics and so on and so forth. I my personal view is no. Obviously, committing ethnic cleansing is wrong. Full stop. No exceptions. 100% of the time, ethnic cleansing is wrong. Period.
I feel like it's kind of late to ponder that question, anyways. I mean, there's already been so much death in the last 7 or 8 decades that it's just whatever conclusion you come to is kind of
I've heard Benny Morris, I think, evoke a situation in Greece and Turkey where ethnic cleansing was a good. I haven't looked into that, but I think also somebody has said taking the Germans that settled in Poland after World War II and removing them was an example of good ethnic cleansing. But the problem is that it's a reaction to ethnic cleansing that was already occurring in Poland. So it's I don't think that it holds the same moral weight. Sorry, we're probably getting a little too deep on that one. But did you have anything? Go ahead.
Well, I would say, look, the basic idea here, the principle upon which Benny Morris is basing this kind of moral or ethical argument is that the Jews have a right to Jewish supremacy, to Jewish domination, to a Jewish self-determination. These are all different spins on the same idea, but that Jews should have special privileges in Israel-Palestine. I mean, if you don't believe that, then why would you ever need to ethnically cleanse anyone in the first place? What's the whole point of it, right? If everyone's equal, if you want to build a state based on the principle of equality, the whole concept of needing to push out one group of people to make space for the other makes no sense at all. So it's kind of based on this concept of Jewish supremacy. So that's why I think your ethical argument is based on the idea of an extremely problematic ethical position in the first place. So. I don't really see. I think Benny Morris, like I said, is a good historian. I think like you said, the Border Wars book. I mean, I think this is one of the most under talked about stories in all of Israel-Palestine history. Which is to say that if you really ask yourself, was it ethnic cleansing? Was it expulsion? Okay, I think the key point is not even really what happened during the war. Whether or not they were expelled by gunpoint during the war or whether they fled on their own during the war. The key point here is what happened after the war. Because if they're allowed back, well, then they weren't ethnically cleansed. There was a war. Maybe they were forced out. But if the Israeli state let them back to, allowed the refugees to return to their homes after the war, well, then it wouldn't have been ethnic cleansing. But of course, that is not what happened. And Benny Morris is the key source here on what happened after the war. Between the end of the war, so basically December 1948 until 1956, the state of Israel massacres somewhere between 2,700 and 5,000 overwhelmingly unarmed Palestinians. Returning to their homes after the war, as refugees so often do at the end of a war. And they were shot mercilessly. It was the Israeli army that was given shoot-to-kill orders. Anyone crossing the armistice lines was shot at.
And most of these people were starving, correct? Like most of these people were like in starving and like horribly impoverished conditions as refugees, right?
That's exactly correct. You're talking about a population of hundreds of thousands of people, totally impoverished, stripped of their means of livelihood. Recall, Palestinians were overwhelmingly farmers. Their means of livelihood was the agricultural produce, was the agricultural surplus. That is how they made a living. And so when you expel them from their lands, you've essentially totally impoverished them and also prevented them from even having a means of subsistence. And so they're returning to their homes, trying to reclaim lost property, trying to actually also, cultivate crops. They're actually going back. That's what happened during the period from in July 1948. In the midst of the 1948 war, you already had hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria, and the summer is the primary harvest season, and they're trying to return to harvest their crops because that is how they're going to survive the war, and that is when Israel realizes, oh my gosh, these Palestinian refugees, they want to return. We need a solution. We need to prevent them from returning. And that is when the Israeli army really realizes, not only do we have to destroy their villages, so they proceed to literally destroy 400 plus Palestinian villages. So they destroy the villages, and then they erect basically outposts in the border areas in the years after the establishment of the state of Israel to prevent those Palestinians from returning home and to shoot at anyone who tries to return.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but they were also poisoning water wells too. So even if, like,
Benny
let's say
Benny Morris is the one who exposed that situation, right? Cast thy bread, lie thy bread operation, where they poisoned the water wells, right?
That's exactly correct. They poisoned. Yeah, he published a piece just in the past year or two. It came out recently. Yeah. These were. There was already, I think, some evidence, some oral testimony, some oral history. Again, this is the kind of classic Benny Morris approach. Is we don't trust the oral history. We're only willing to trust the written documentation, the archival record. But here is another example where the archival reports and documents end up corroborating the oral history and the oral testimony, and also I think some other written documentary evidence, maybe not archival evidence, but other documentary sources. But yeah, it's essentially now proven that the Zionist forces poisoned wells during the 1948 war to prevent Palestinians who were expelled from their homes from returning.
So we talk about all that, right? We talk about all of this like amazing information that we can get from his book, Israel's Border Wars, which in my opinion, I agree with you, is literally the most underrated book in all of, Israeli Palestinian history. I'm probably going to skip the question because we just went over there, but I had a question that was like, it seems like when we talk about the history, it goes from the war in 1948 and then flies right to 1967, maybe doing a pit stop for the Suez crisis. But nobody talks about the things that happened in those years, which I agree with you. If we want to use the argument that all of the ethnic cleansing happened as a result of in the fog of war, all these things were happening. There was a war going on. All of that is completely contradicted by the fact that you just didn't let the refugees return to their homes. And then like, I always, Benny Morris also brings this up. He's like, well, they believed that the Palestinians would be like a subversive population. And it's like, where would we accept that? Like, for example, Stalin in the Soviet Union ethnically cleansed or ethnically moved a bunch of Korean people during the war with Japan because he couldn't trust them to not be spies. They could be Japanese spies simply because they have a Korean ethnicity. So he moved them into Siberia. Do we accept that as like a thing that's a reasonable thing to do during wars, to take a population just simply because of their ethnicity and be like, can't trust them, they're this ethnicity, move them out or move them to Siberia? Like, I just don't understand how they can say that. It's like, it seems like we wouldn't accept that in any other context.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, they continue to face persecution and expulsion and military occupation within the borders of the state of Israel and without long after 1948. This is another point that is often forgotten, which is that you had tens of thousands of Bedouin, of Palestinians in Israel in the aftermath of the 48 war. So basically from 48, 49 until 1953, I think you had something like 15,000 Bedouins that were expelled from their villages and from their towns in the Naqab, in the Negev, southern Israel, southern Palestine. Long after the war ended. I think Ilan Pape argues that there's something like 36 Palestinian villages from 48, 49 until 67, which are ethnically cleansed. Again, the war's over. There's no excuse that this is some wartime need or out of the agency of kind of wartime needs. No, the war is over and they're still being expelled. In addition to that, you have multiple court cases of Palestinian refugees who are now living in Lebanon or Syria, who take their cases to the Israeli Supreme Court, right? And because what happened was in the aftermath of the war, you have all of these Palestinians that are told, just evacuate your village for 2 weeks and you can come back. Right. And then of course they're not allowed back. It's been a month, it's been 3 months, it's been 6 months, they're not allowed back. They take their cases to the Supreme Court and they win. And the Israeli Supreme Court says, look, the Israeli military, you told these people they would be allowed back after 2 weeks and you didn't allow them back. You were required to allow them back. And what does the Israeli military do in multiple cases in 1951 and 1953? What did they do?
They let them back. No, I'm just kidding. I'm sorry.
They enter those Palestinian villages and they destroy them. They prevent the Palestinians from returning through the physical destruction of those villages. And then, of course,
they dynamite the houses, right?
They dynamite the houses. Rajesh Haidar writes about this, as do some other Palestinian historians. So then you have the Palestinians who are slaughtered on their way coming back in as unarmed refugees, trying to reclaim lost property, see family, and harvest crops. You have the Palestinians within the borders of the state of Israel who are expelled from the borders of the state of Israel after 49. You have the Palestinians who are told they're allowed back, who aren't allowed back, who their villages are subsequently whose villages are subsequently destroyed. Then you also have the Palestinian refugees within the borders. We could call them IDPs, right? So the Palestinian internally displaced persons. So they are originally from, let's say, Haifa before 48. They wind up in the Galilee somewhere in Sakhnin, who knows where. Their property in Haifa is confiscated. You have, I think, 1.5 million dunams of property that is owned by Palestinian citizens of Israel now, whose property is confiscated merely because they were displaced from their homes as a result of the war and were not physically present in their home at the time that Israeli military and police go around the country. They're not physically present in their erstwhile property, which is then confiscated. And then on top of that, the Palestinians are then subject to a military regime within the borders of the state of Israel from 48 to 66. So if you want to leave your town in Sakhnin and go to the town over in Araba or in Nasra, in Nazareth, guess what? You need a permit to do that. You need a permit to travel 2 kilometers to see your brother or your sister or your mother. If you are a Palestinian citizen of Israel within the borders of the state of Israel from 48 to 66. So we're talking about layers and layers of domination, of control, of dispossession, of property confiscation, of mass murder, the Palestinian space from 48 until 67.
And I was just going to add, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like, this is a place that, like, under Ottoman rule, travel was a little bit more liberal. You were able to just kind of like go wherever, like, within the boundaries of the empire, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's exactly correct. You could take a train from Beirut to Haifa, to Jaffa, to Gaza. You could go from Beirut to Gaza in a few hours. You could travel from Baghdad to Jerusalem by train. You could go from Baghdad to Damascus. From Damascus, you can go to Beirut. From Beirut to Jaffa. From Jaffa to Jerusalem, all within a day or two of travel. I mean,
right.
You could cross from Damascus. You could cross Syria.
No
Palestine.
Passport necessary.
In the 1920s and 30s, they did start to introduce border controls. Recall this is a period in international history in which, borders are starting to take shape. So there is a frontier, but you are allowed to cross it. You just will have to, go through a military checkpoint because there was quite a great deal of smuggling. Drugs were smuggled across those frontiers in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And so they did start to introduce border controls, but you could still cross.
Okay. Sorry. I wanted to get just like 2 more things on this topic with Benny Morris, because it's something that I've had a lot of trouble. Like, I have a lot of trouble rectifying some of the things that he writes versus some of the conclusions that he comes to. And that specifically comes on this topic of transfer, which you've already alluded to a little bit. So my question is, while contributing greatly to the history of Israel's mistreatment of Palestinians, Morris also steadfastly maintains that transfer was never a feature of official Israeli policy. Now, I do have a quote here from Benny Morris from his book, Righteous Victims. And it says, "The transfer idea did not originate with the Peel Commission. It goes back to the fathers of modern Zionism, and while rarely given a public airing before 1937, was one of the main currents in Zionist ideology from the movement's inception." Can you just speak to like is there an incongruence between the things that he writes and then coming to this conclusion that it was never an official policy? Like, is that because it was just never written down on a piece of paper? Like, it seems like his own books are replete. Like, I have like an almost 30-page document of quotations I had from Benny Morris of examples of transfer being discussed at the highest levels of Zionism for decades up until 1948, whether it's publicly, privately. Do you find it difficult to like digest that conclusion that he comes to?
Yeah, I think this is one of the cases where Benny Morris really does lose a great deal of credibility here, because he himself documents in 30 pages, as you said, I believe, in his The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, as well as his later works. He has 20, 30 pages where he's talking about the idea of transfer, the concept of transfer in Zionist thinking. Having said that, he's actually not the go-to source on this question. It's Nur Masalha's book, which is published, I believe, in the early 1990s. And it is a 300-page book documenting in excruciating detail every Zionist leader. And there's basically no exceptions here. Right. Every Zionist leader is talking about transfer openly, is basically pro-transfer. And I think it is worth recounting that history a little bit, because the record is quite unambiguous. You have Theodore Herzl write in his diary in the 1890s.
Spirit the penniless population.
Well, very good. You have the exact quote because it's such a famous quote. He's writing in his diary for years and years. I think the interesting point about Theodore Herzl is, we need to spirit the penniless population across the border, but we must do it
circumspectly and discreetly. Yes.
Right, because he's already aware. So he writes that in his diary. He doesn't write it in a public place. So he's already aware from the earliest Zionist leaders, before there's even really much of a Zionist movement to speak of, that in order for us to ultimately establish a Jewish state in Palestine, we've got a problem, which is that Palestine is already inhabited. 85% of its inhabitants are non-Jewish. And there's no way to establish a Jewish state in a land that is overwhelmingly non-Jewish without figuring out a solution for the native inhabitants. So Theodor Herzl is aware of that in the 1890s. By the 1920s, you have a number of Zionist leaders speaking about this policy openly. I believe it's Israel Zangwill, who's writing about, maybe it's another Zionist leader as well. They're publishing articles in Zionist newspapers, openly speaking of transfer. Why? Because they see it. They see that the Palestinians will actually benefit. This is the insanity of the Zionist enterprise. They think they're actually doing a service to the indigenous inhabitants by pushing them across the border, where they'll have more land, where there won't be overcrowding. Right? This is going to be in the interest of the native inhabitants to expel them to Transjordan or elsewhere. By 1930, you have Chaim Weizmann, who is, you could say, the chief Zionist advocate abroad. He is kind of the leader of the Zionist movement outside of Palestine. He adopts this proposal called the Rutenberg-Weizmann proposal of 1930, in which he pitches this idea to the British, because the British are the ones in charge of Palestine, and he's lobbying in London. He's lobbying British officials in London and proposes to them this idea to basically raise money. So he's basically saying, we're going to raise money. Don't worry about the money. We'll buy the land in Transjordan. We'll buy like 1 million dunams of land in Transjordan so that we can resettle 70,000 Palestinians there. That is the idea that he proposes to the British. And of course, it's forcible expulsion, right? They're not given it. They're not consulted on whether they want to go to Transjordan. They will be moved to Transjordan. And that is a 1930 proposal of the leader of the Zionist movement in London in 1930. By the 1930s, you have, what's his name? Arthur Rupin is talking about transfer. Arthur Rupin, by the way, is one of the, actually, you could call him one of the most kind of liberal, open-minded Zionists of all. He is part of Brit Shalom in the 1920s, this group of Zionists that basically is advocating for a binational solution. In 1929, after the Burak uprising, the intercommunal violence between Jews and Palestinians in 1929, after that uprising, he basically abandons this idea for a binational state. Brit Shalom falls into disarray. And he starts talking about transfer as well. Then you have, Joseph Weitz, the leader of the transfer committees in 48, who is one of the leaders of the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. He's openly talking about transfer in the 30s and 40s. You have Ben-Gurion himself, who in response to the Peel Commission says, yeah, this would be a great idea. In fact, Ben-Gurion says in the late 30s, he says, look, forcible transfer is not fundamentally that different from what we've already been doing. We've already been taking over land. We've been buying the land, and we've been displacing the Palestinians living on it. We've been doing this for decades. He says that in the late 30s.
Says, I see nothing immoral about it.
Exactly right. He doesn't see it as a problem. And obviously, Jeff Zabotinsky, the right-wing revisionist leader, he's all in on transfer. For him, that's the only solution. So it almost doesn't matter. Ushishkin is another Zionist leader in the 30s and 40s who is, I believe, Ushishkin is a Russian Zionist who is, I believe, the leader of JNF. He's also pro-transfer. It almost doesn't really matter which Zionist leader you're talking about. They're all pro-transfer. Some of them more publicly than others. Some of them realize that when you talk about transfer, you're raising the ires and the fears of the native population. You're bringing, you're attracting controversy to the Zionist movement. And so plenty of Zionist leaders are kind of careful not to talk about it in public. But in behind closed doors in private, they're all pro-transfer.
Well, and I think Benny Morris speaks to this exactly in at least Righteous Victims, where he says that they were aware that you don't want to rile the suspicions of the indigenous people, but also I believe isn't there something either Ben Gurion is quoted as saying this or Benny Morris says about it, he's like he didn't want to be known in history as the great expeller. So you know what I mean? There was also it seems to be an almost conspiratorial idea among Zionists to not make this official policy, but wink, wink, we all know. So it seems very slippery and in my opinion, disingenuous for Benny Morris to harp on this word official. It wasn't official policy, as if there's no single document that is the smoking gun of that. But it seems that's the one dot that isn't connected in an array of dots that are all very much connected and almost obvious in my opinion. Do you agree that even Benny Morris seems to suggest that they knew and knew that this needed to be a little bit unofficial, but everybody kind of knew what the implication was?
everyone knew what the implication was. And it became all the more obvious after the partition plan of November 1947, which called for the establishment of a Jewish state with a 45% minority of Palestinians, right?
Right.
That was when it occurred to the Zionists, right? It became immediately obvious. It was already obvious before, but when the lines were drawn and the borders were proposed, that is when it hit every Zionist leader. How are we going to establish a state that is basically half Palestinian? Right? That is a huge, huge problem. And they're all very, very well aware of the implications. They've been talking about the implications of establishing a Jewish state in a majority Palestinian country for decades. But now that the borders are proposed, it's even more obvious. And then, and that's why I think if you read, if you read these plans, plan C, plan Gimel, plan Dalet, there's multiple plans, even before plan Dalet, there's like plan Bet, plan Gimel, plan Dalet. If you read these plans as anything other than a blueprint for ethnic cleansing, you're being dishonest with the story and the evidence and the narrative, which is that, as a historian, because here's what you have to ask yourself. What is your role as a historian? Your role is to make sense of disparate shards of evidence, incomplete evidence. Obviously, actors in history are trying their best to conceal crimes, to prevent later generations from knowing the crimes that they committed. So it's your role as a historian, whenever you're trying to understand, criminal history, ethnic histories of ethnic cleansing, histories of genocide, it's your role to read between the lines, to piece together these disparate shards of evidence. And if you read Zionist history, as we've already talked about, for decades and decades, where every major Zionist leader is talking about transfer, is openly supporting transfer, and then you see what happens in the partition plan, and then you see what the Zionist leadership does in the aftermath of that partition plan, and come to a conclusion other than this is a blueprint for ethnic cleansing, you're just a dishonest historian.
Well, okay. So one last question regarding Benny Morris, and I was like working on like a YouTube video essay about this topic of transfer and the inconsistencies. So that's why, like, when I got the chance to talk to you, I was like, I have to discuss some of these topics with him. So this last one on is kind of like, again, like kind of like a meta discussion of Israeli historiography, and it's that like I think Benny Morris is without question considered like to be the most like prominent of the Israeli new historians, like the most mainstream, the most well regarded, I would say, but like. It seems that he's also standing in opposition to a lot of the other, at least the surviving Israeli new historians. For example, he has like a somewhat public beef with Ilan Pappé, where he calls Ilan Pappé the sloppiest historian of all time. And then, Avi Shleim actually well, this book is like a collection of his writings, but one of the last chapters in this book is called Benny Morris and the Betrayal of History. So like, this is even like almost like a diss track in here where Avi Shleim is talking about Benny Morris. And then obviously you can introduce Finkelstein in the more modern era, who also has had like public, disagreements with Benny Morris about this exact thing that we were talking about, the topic of transfer and things like that. And like, my question is like, why do you think Benny Morris has this very, very high stature when it seems that like from this other group of Israeli new historians, it seems that more of them, like 2/3 of the surviving ones, actually disagree with him as opposed to his conclusions on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think Benny Morris wasn't afraid to take a public to have kind of let's say more of a public role, as a public historian, right? He was publishing pieces in, the New York Review of Books, and he would do interviews with the New York Times, and he, obviously, in Haaretz, and when he would publish a major article in a peer-reviewed journal, he would also publish a piece in Haaretz, the kind of popular version of it. So he has long taken this kind of more public persona, and he doesn't shy away from the public spotlight at all. He does interviews with with all of the mainstream Israeli media channels, as well as in English and in Hebrew. So, he is very much in the public spotlight. Why that is the case is a good question. Look, I think one of the reasons why the Israeli public is so open to him is because, on the one hand, he does have this credibility as a historian, even writing the history that Israelis themselves don't really accept. I would say your average Israeli kind of is somewhat aware, is clearly, isn't ignorant of the Nakba story and isn't unaware of it, but generally speaking would dismiss it as as, oh, well, there were also calls for them to leave, and it's also the Arabs. So maybe they're able to hold these both narratives in their head at the same times, right?
Right.
But they're open to Benny Morris because he openly, is supporting the Israeli military in its mass murder campaigns in Gaza, both in the recent, genocidal war, but also going back 2 decades, right? In the Second Intifada, he said, he was quoted in an interview as saying, if only we had finished the job in 48, we wouldn't be having this Intifada right now. So he has been this sort of right wing, I would even say, well, maybe in the Israeli spectrum, he's actually still left, which is insane.
It's wild, yeah.
But
there's people more right wing than like.
I think that's a great answer, though, is like, he kind of walks the line a little bit of like exposing the crimes of the past while also having like a veneer of like, acceptability of the whole project, whereas Ilan Pappé and Avi Shlaim might be a little bit more condemning of the entire project as well. So I think that's a great answer. I'm going to move off of Benny Morris now. It's a favorite topic of mine, but now I kind of want to get into more like specific historical topics that I had questions about. And the first comes from like prior to the establishment of Israel, I believe around the time of the Arab uprising in the 1930s. And recently I was reading a book by my historian Mike Davis. It's called Buddha's Wagon. It's actually like a history of car bombing, which is like kind of a very, I understand, morbid topic, but there's a chapter in this about the early days of the Lehi and the Stern Gang and some of the Zionist terrorism that occurred prior to the formation of the state of Israel. And he quotes actually Ben Gurion in this book, who witnessed a bombing happen. And this is what he says. He says, I had never imagined such destruction. I didn't recognize the streets, horror and hatred, but I couldn't forget that our thugs and murderers had blazed this trail in Haifa, at the King David, the Goldschmidt House, and elsewhere. And essentially what Ben Gurion is quoted as saying here, and what Mike Davis says here, is that it was actually like Zionist paramilitary or terrorist groups that actually like began the process of like these kinds of like indiscriminate bombing attacks against Palestinian civilians. And I thought that was interesting because I think history is portrayed very differently by a lot of mainstream sources. But I found it very interesting that he actually even quoted Ben Gurion subtly acknowledging this fact.
That's very interesting. I was not aware of that quote, but it doesn't surprise me at all. I would say that of course, Israel-Palestine was you could say that there was plenty of violence against civilians prior to the Lehi and the Stern Gang, both Zionist violence against Palestinians and Palestinian violence against Zionists. But I would say that before the Lehi and the Stern Gang really started to embrace this approach in a very systematic way, the violence was sporadic. It was, a riot that devolved into a massacre, but it wasn't like, I'm going to plant a bomb in a bus station or in a busy market.
And, it wasn't terrorism.
It wasn't terrorism.
Before.
I'm going to plant bombs on these 2 British officers and then hang them from trees.
It's like, any multi-ethnic community is going to have certain pitfalls of tension between that, especially, in previous times. But there's a difference between, like you said, systemic terrorism and ethnic clashes between a multi-ethnic society.
Yeah, that's exactly right, and I think I think Ben Gurion was correct. It was these Jewish terrorist groups that really pioneered terrorism in British Mandatory Palestine, right? They and if you know that history well, you know that these after the Great Arab Revolt from 36 to 39, one of the largest anti-colonial revolts in all of colonial history, the British realized that the Zionist project is not acceptable to the native inhabitants, who have no desire to see their country handed over to Jews who want to make them second-class citizens in that country. And so they revolt. And in the aftermath of that revolt, the British introduced a white paper which severely restricts Jewish immigration to 75,000 Jews over the course of the next 5 years. Recall that prior to this revolt, you had 30, 40, 50, 60,000 Zionists arriving in Palestine every year in 1933 and 34 and 35 and 36. And then obviously that, that number diminished significantly during the revolt itself. But the Zionists were obviously hoping that number would then pick back up to this, 50, 60, 70,000 Zionist immigrants per year in the aftermath of that revolt, especially at a time when Jews are being slaughtered in the millions in Europe. And that's exactly when the British closed the door to Zionist immigration in Palestine. By the way, they closed it in Great Britain as well. The Americans closed their doors. Everyone is closing their doors to Jewish immigrants.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
And the British obviously do in Palestine as well. And that enrages and inflames the Zionist leadership in Palestine. And that's when you see the Zionist community turn to these, acts of terrorism and violence against, British military, police, and civilians in British Mandatory Palestine.
Okay. This next question, I think, is going to be very interesting, especially with your background of discussing the Palestinian identity prior to the establishment of Israel, or like a Zionist, settlement. And it's actually a quote that I have from Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine by Ilan Pappé. And he has this quote here, and maybe you can correct me. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing this person's name wrong. Ben Zvi.
Ben Zvi, yeah.
Ben Zvi. Okay. Ilan Pappé states, and this is going to be regarding just like this concept of religion and ethnicity and how these things kind of tangle together with Israel, where it's kind of hard to tell where an ethnicity starts and a religion begins and vice versa. And Ilan Pappé states that Ben Zvi himself had published a book in Yiddish with Ben Gurion as early as 1918, in which they claimed that the Arab Fellahin, the peasant farmers, were the descendants of Jewish peasants who had stayed behind in Palestine after the Roman exile. Ben Zvi continued to develop this argument in the 1930s and 40s. In his book, Gate to the Jewish Settlement, he similarly argued that villagers in the Hebron Mountains were actually Jews who had converted to Islam. So, we know that the general Zionist narrative is that there was, the kingdom of Judea, and then they were exiled by the Romans. But what this is saying is that there were some of them that stayed back, and then in the subsequent generations, over the many years, over the centuries, converted to Islam. So there are people that have a continuity with the ethnic people of Judea, but just after all of these centuries, just so happened to convert to Islam. However, they're being ethnically cleansed on the basis of being non-Jewish. However, if we can find that ethnic continuity, now you have ethnic Poles coming and ethnically cleansing ethnic people who have an ethnic continuity to the time of Judea. It makes this whole thing start to get so confusing. And then when I think about Israel, says things such as we're the only Jewish state among a sea of Arabs, but then at that point, there's a binary between being Jewish and being Arab. But then if you call Israel an apartheid state, they say, oh, there's tons of Arab Jews here. That we have Arab Jews. And then, so now it's not much of a binary anymore. Because now we're obviously an Arab person can be Jewish. That's not that's not a
Avi Schleim.
Yeah. These aren't mutually exclusive things. So can you kind of help, because I think this is confusing for probably a lot of people if they get into this, where religion starts and ethnicity ends, and then how this all relates to these people that, at least from what I quote from Pape, are verifiably have a continuity to the original ethnic inhabitants of Judea.
Yeah, it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah.
I think that human diversity is infinitely complex, and religion and ethnicity and nationality are terms human beings invented. They're not imprinted in our DNA, right? If I take a DNA test, I know that 23andMe will tell you you're 17% X and 43% Y. But the reality is, even those percentages that they're giving you are themselves based on how similar or different you are to other groups of people who are also themselves mixes of different backgrounds and ethnicities and religions and nationalities. Human diversity is infinitely complex. And what we've been trying to do as a species over the course of many thousands, tens of thousands of years really, is trying to fit this infinite complexity and infinite diversity into categories, into boxes. You're either white or you're black. You know, you're either Arab or you're Jewish. You're either Palestinian or you're Israeli, right? We're trying to fit people into boxes, even though that is obviously not the nature of the universe. The nature of the universe is, well, I'm, 0.01% X and 0.01% Y, and then I'm 0.01% of tens of thousands of other things, because that is the nature of human diversity. So I would say, generally speaking, anyone who tells you, oh, this is a religion and that's an ethnicity, and it is kind of just trying to fool you, really, and trying to convince you of something that's just not really the case. I mean, even if you take Jews, for example, right? There obviously are certain things that Ashkenazi Jews have in common. The instance, for example, of breast cancer among Ashkenazi women is incredibly high. In fact, Israeli Ashkenazi women, I think, have an instance like one of, if not the highest rates of breast cancer in the world. And that's because you have centuries and centuries of a certain populations of people in Eastern Europe inbreeding. And so you get concentrations of certain chromosomes and certain genetic traits. But then obviously, Arab Jewish women don't have that problem at all. So but that's just one example, right? But so even to say, Jews are all of a certain nationality or of a certain religion, I mean, what you're doing is you're obliterating the complexities within Jewish populations.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
The same is true of Palestinians, right? You have Palestinian black people who are descendants from, people who migrated from Africa 100 or 200 years ago. You have Palestinians that come from Egypt, Palestinians from Syria, Palestinians who have been living in Palestine for 2 millennia, right? So all of these populations that we want to say are X, Y, or Z, or are fundamentally different from another population, this is all human fiction. This is all our own imagination, trying to categorize and put people into boxes, even though, as we said, human diversity is infinitely complex.
So just to summarize what you're saying is kind of like we have all these socially constructed categories of people, and sometimes they're weaponized for political gains. And that's probably what we're seeing here in a lot of in terms of Israel, is like, it's not so much that there's any kind of concrete conclusion on any of this. It's merely just we have all these socially constructed categories, and people generally like to use them for political purposes.
That's exactly correct.
Okay.
So it's a lot like, the I guess American conception at this point of like whiteness, where whiteness is like one of the few socially constructed races where it's based more so about like what you are not rather than like what you are. Because at any point, like that whiteness can ebb and flow, like, you're just still in the same place, like, as far as immutable characteristics, but, that label of whiteness kind of can leave you or like suddenly be cast over you.
Right.
That's exactly right.
So that question kind of leads me to this one, and it's also with surrounds ethnicity as a concept, right? And it's kind of this thing that I think you're forced to confront when you're considering Israel, and that really is like at what point does an ethnic group deserve a state at the expense of another people? So I wrote this question out. The justification for Israel's founding and continued military operations are typically based on the fact that Jewish people have been historically persecuted, and thus it was imperative that a state be consecrated for their safety. I am in no way attempting to downplay the horrific treatment of Jews within Europe. However, this justification does raise the question, at what point does an ethnic group deserve a state at the expense of another people? For example, at what point do we need to carve out a state for the Roma people, who have been historically persecuted within Europe and currently live as a minority group in several European states? Then I think I bring up the Rohingya people, the Kurds, the countless ethno-linguistic group all throughout the Western Hemisphere of indigenous people, that all of which have no state to claim their own. If we're to if we're to take the justification for the state of Israel at being created at the expense of another people, then don't we have to extend that to the, I think, thousands of ethnic groups that exist on this planet with only 92 countries or something like that? Like, how do we make sense of that in terms of, because it seems like a lot of people in the case of Israel just take this as a given. It's like, oh, well, duh, there's no Jewish state. They need a state. Let's carve it out of Palestine.
Where's the state for the Druze?
The Druze don't even have a state. That's another.
Yeah. I think this is a fascinating question. I love this topic.
Yeah.
I think my perspective here is that when I want to ask myself, as an American Jew, where am I safest in the world? I'm going to look around at countries which which treat people equally before the law. So you have the rule of law, okay,
Right.
where you have division of powers such that one branch of the government isn't any more powerful than another branch of the government, where it's much harder for, say, an autocratic leader or a leader with autocratic tendencies to come in and obliterate all the other branches of government, okay? Like, I want to live in a country that has an independent judiciary. I want to live in a country that has a free press, an independent media. I want to live in a country that has strong civil society, right? I want to live in a country that values human life, that supports human rights around the world, that believes that healthcare is a right, right? That those are the things that I care about when I want to.
Where is this place?
Now, where in that list of things that I just rattled off did you hear? Well, an ethno state.
Right.
Ethno states are bad.
Right.
Ethno states don't protect either the ethnic majority that they claim to protect, or obviously the ethnic minorities that they don't claim to protect. And I think history bears this out. Find me an ethno state in the world where either the ethno majority or the ethno minorities have been safe. I mean, please, I think this is just a question of history. It's an empirical question for me, which is that when I ask myself, how do I preserve my own safety? Again, as a human being, where do I want to live? And I think the key question here is, let's suppose let's ask a hypothetical question. I'm a person, I'm a Homo sapien. And I'm said, okay, I'm going to put you in any country in the world, but I'm not going to tell you what your race or your religion or your ethnicity is.
Oh, I love this question.
It's going to be it's going to be a roll of the dice. You don't get to choose. You don't get to choose whether you're Jewish or Palestinian or white or black or Hispanic. I'm just going to put you in any country. Well, what country are you do you want to live in? Well, it's going to be one of the countries that checks the most number of those boxes that we just talked about. It's not going to be an ethno state, because if you don't know what your ethnicity or your religion or your nationality is, you want to be in a country that doesn't care what your religion or your ethnicity is.
Right.
And so I think, and by the way, I think the evidence bears out the point that I'm making, which is that you go to Israel. Let's just even assume you're a Jew. You're a Jew in Israel. You wind up in Israel in 1948, okay? You fled Europe because you were being persecuted there, because there were all these ethno states in Europe that were persecuting minorities like Jews. So you fled Europe. You went to Palestine, where you thought you were going to be safe because Palestine was supposedly going to be this sanctuary for Jews. 1% of Jews perished in the 1948 war. 6,000 Jews died in that war out of a community of 600,000 people. So tell me, what other Jewish community in the world over the past 75 years has had a mortality rate at any point in the past 75 years of 1%? The answer is zero. Because no Jewish population anywhere else in the world, from 1947 to the present, as far as I know, has ever seen a 1% mortality rate, and that was just in 48. Then you had Israel.
Jersey, so I'm from New Jersey. I've been going to school with Jewish people my entire life. You know what I mean? And been to Jewish parties and things like that. It's like
we're very proud of our bagels here in Jersey.
Yeah, we have great bagels.
Patterson, New Jersey, I hear, is home to both Jews and Palestinians. They're living side by side in peace. Why is that? Well, because it doesn't matter if you're Palestinian.
Exactly.
I mean, in theory, right?
It's not an ethno state. It's not an ethno state.
It's not an ethno state. And so if
Shout
you
out
go
to Passaic County.
So if you go to an ethno state, even one where you're the ethnic majority, where you're supposedly going to be protected, you're going to face a 1% mortality rate in 48. Your soldiers are going to face border raids throughout the 1950s. Why? Because you just ethnically cleansed an entire population in order to establish your ethno state. In 56, you're going to be killed in the hundreds. In 67, you're going to be killed in the hundreds. In 73, you're going to be killed in the thousands. In the 80s and 90s and 2000s, you're going to be blown up in cafes and buses. Yeah. And then on October 7th, you're going to be slaughtered en masse.
Yeah.
And you're telling me that state is protecting you?
That's the safest place to be.
Also, your hypothetical of being born Jewish and then you go to Palestine in 1948. They slap an army helmet on you and hand you, what was it? A Czech rifle with a swastika on it, and you're just like, what is what? What's happening?
That's Elon Pape mentions that when they got the Czech arms shipment prior to the war, that some of them, they were old Nazi weapons from before the Czech Republic was liberated, and some had swastika engraved on them.
I mean, there's another interesting anecdote. I believe Max Blumenthal loves to share this anecdote of in the 1930s, there was a Zionist leader who invited a Nazi official.
Yes.
It was at 1935, 6, 7. I can't remember.
Stern Gang. I think the
Yeah,
Stern
it was the
Gang
leader of the Lehi, wasn't it?
Was like the British, like the enemy of the enemy is my friend. Our enemy is the British, and so that means we can speak with the Nazis to coordinate against the British. So yeah, that was definitely, and they consider themselves like some what was it,
National Bolshevik,
National Bolshevik kind of thing. Like the Stern Gang was a real interesting.
There was a lot going on there. They're a very nuanced group of people for that time.
And so there was this kind of secret alliance between some of these extremist Jewish groups and the Nazis, who had the same goal of ridding Europe of the Jews. The Nazis didn't care where they went. The Zionists obviously wanted them to all go to Palestine. You even have a quote by Ben Gurion himself, who said, "If I had two options, which was I believe, I could save all the Jews of Europe,
of the Holocaust,
but they would go to Europe, they would go to the United States and the New World, or I could only save half of the Jews of Europe, but the half that I saved would come to Palestine. I choose the latter." And that's a Ben Gurion quote. So there was this, the Jews of the safety of the Jews of Europe was always secondary to the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And that was the Zionist attitude, I would say, in the 1930s and the 1940s, even at the peak of anti-Semitism in Europe, even at the peak of kind of Nazi reign across continental Europe.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but like even into today, you have anti-Semitic leaders like Viktor Orban and
Richard Spencer too, like an American Nazi like Richard Spencer is like I support Israel. I definitely think the Jews should go there. You know what I mean? Like you hear this across like neo-Nazi channels for sure.
But on like a geopolitical level, right? Like the more like I guess like Hungarian like Jewish people right within that country feel unsafe, the more likely it is that they're going to feel like, well, I can be safe in Israel, right? So it almost kind of behooves, right, the political establishment within Israel is like, yeah, we want to foster relations with like, these countries that create a hostile environment, right, for their own domestic Jewish population so that they can feel safer moving here.
Look, over the past couple of months, you've had 6, 7, 8, I can't even keep track of the number of manufactured incidents of anti-Semitism. You have Jews, you have Zionists, essentially trying to manufacture anti-Semitism where none exists. You have these Zionists like standing in front in the college campus protests saying, "I'm a Jew, I'm a Zionist, attack me."
Okay.
And they're just completely ignored, right? No one cares about this.
They're saying it to a bunch of Jewish college kid protesters.
So are we.
We're also Jewish.
I mean, and the reason is obvious, is that Zionism needs anti-Semitism. The fuel of Zionism today is anti-Semitism. In a world without anti-Semitism, what purpose does Zionism serve? Why do you need to establish a Jewish ethno-state in a land that is majority non-Jewish, or in a land that is at least half non-Jewish? In a world where Jews aren't facing persecution. It just doesn't make any sense. And so there's this constant need and desire to dig and find anti-Semitism, invent it if you can't find it. And this has been the case for decades. I mean, Norman Finkelstein wrote about this in the 1980s, right? Yeah.
Even prior to, when we go back to the Lavon affair and the thing that Avi Shlaim speaks about, what Avi Shlaim speaks about that in Iraq there was certain bombings that were carried out by a Zionist like secret agency, intelligence agencies, and things like that, strictly for the purpose of fomenting and manufacturing perceived or real anti-Semitism. And there definitely was real anti-Semitism. I'm not trying to say that there was none and everything was great, but there, from what I understand from Avi Shlaim and from the Lavon affair, is that there was a concerted effort by Zionists to foment and manufacture anti-Semitism within surrounding Arab states for the purpose of causing the emigration of the Jewish inhabitants there to the new state of Israel because they needed more settlers.
Yeah, that's exactly correct. There was attempts to place bombs in synagogues in Baghdad, in Iraq. That is, Avi Shlaim talks about that in his most recent memoir. That is somewhat of a controversial affair, and there are some people who dispute that. So question mark if that happened or not. I think there's
I
plenty
agree,
of evidence to believe it did happen, but you could still be a reasonable person and say, that's propaganda. There were also attempts in Egypt, as you said, the Levant affair of early 1950s, was it?
Yeah.
In which there's basically similar story where you have, Israeli Zionist spies trying to stoke fear in the Jewish community of Egypt to encourage flight. And by the way, you have the same kind of thing happening today in places like France, where there's this constant argument made by Israeli leaders. The anti-Semitism has never been worse in France. You're much better off moving to Israel, picking up arms, and getting killed by a Qassam rocket in Gaza. And that's where you're going to be safe.
Right.
But this has been ongoing for decades, and you even see this the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League in the United States, an organization whose ostensible purpose is to document anti-Semitism and to defend Jews from anti-Semitism. This organization, since 2021, so this is already 3 years in the making now, describes pro-Palestine protests. I mean, I don't even know why we're calling them pro-Palestine. They should just be called pro-human rights protests, anti-war protests, anti-genocide protests, anti-indiscriminate slaughter protests. They've been describing such protests as anti-Semitic since 2021. Now, we don't even have reliable data anymore on what's anti-Semitic and what isn't. They've obliterated even the basic meaning of anti-Semitism. And the erstwhile organization that was documenting anti-Semitism is now unreliable. Even Wikipedia is now saying you can't trust ADL's numbers, because they're including things that are obviously not anti-Semitic as anti-Semitic in their accounts on the number of anti-Semitic incidents every year. And so we don't even have reliable data anymore on what is and is not anti-Semitism, because the organizations tasked with documenting it have obliterated the meaning of the term. And so this is where we are today. And it's actually, and so the organizations tasked with, defending Jews from anti-Semitism, I think, are now some of the organizations chiefly responsible for increasing the danger posed to Jews. Because in a world where we don't know if there's anti-Semitism, how can we even say there's a rise of anti-Semitism? We don't even know anymore, which is actually quite dangerous, and it's quite dangerous to Jews.
Right. That was an amazing answer. I know I have just a couple more questions. Are you all right, or do you want to? Sure.
Yeah. No, for sure.
All right. I just want to be mindful of your time. We've been going for about an hour. We're definitely towards the end of what I have here. I have 3 more questions. Is that cool?
Yeah, let's do it.
So the next one, we've been kind of tiptoeing up through the conflict a little bit. And the next one is kind of going to surround 1948 and really how the official phase of the war began. Because, I felt like it was very revealing when I read Ilan Pappé's book, At the Cleansing of Palestine. And he brought up that I believe Deir Yassin and many of the things prior to that occurred before the formal declaration of war from the surrounding Arab states. Because this is what you hear in the Zionist narrative of the history, is that we tried to make a state, we got attacked from all angles, we had to defend ourselves, we had to ethnically cleanse some people. It's just kind of the way it goes. But Ilan Pappé says, well, they had already depopulated all of these villages, killed X amount of people before the surrounding Arab states even declared war. Now, Benny Morris, on the other hand, will say there's a 2-phase war, I believe before April 1948 or May 1948 and then before. And he categorizes the before time, meaning before the surrounding Arab states declared war and invaded, as a period of still warfare between, I guess, Palestinians and maybe some of the other Arab irregulars being there. Now, that's, I think, typically how it's looked at mainstream. And I'm sorry to keep going in on Benny Morris here, but I have a quote from Benny Morris from Righteous Victims, which tends to kind of contradict this, even though this is the justification that he relies on. And he said, he's talking about the Haganah, which says that the Haganah reprisal raids tended to be disproportionate to the original Arab offense. This strategy tended to spread the conflagration to areas that had been untroubled by the hostilities. From the first, the IZL and the LHI, and to a lesser degree the Haganah, used terror tactics against civilian and militia centers. And then later he says, but the IZL and the LHI, using terrorism against civilians, had a major hand in turning what were sporadic Arab riots and armed attacks into bitter, full-scale war. So he's pointing out that, yes, there's still riots and sporadic kind of disorganized attacks. But then the Lehi and the Stern Gang, I believe that's what IZL and LHI stand for, right?
Right, yeah.
It had these terror tactics that turned these kind of decentralized, ethnic tensions into bitter, full-scale war. Can you kind of speak to about how that really kicked off the real phase of the war?
Yeah. So first of all, the IZL I think usually refers to Irgun. So you had
Irgun, right?
Yeah, that's right. So you had the Haganah, which is, let's say, the organization that became the Israeli military after May 48. Then you have Lehi. Then you have Irgun. And then you also have Stern. So there's at least 4 paramilitary groups.
I thought the Palmach was
that Palmach was a group of Jewish like troops that they were training for the war in World War II.
Right.
Hitler to come into the Middle East, and that's where they trained the Palmach. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. You also have Palmach, which I believe is eventually folded into the Haganah. But but you could say that the 1948 war is divided into 3 periods, 3 phases. The first is from November until I would say May. That period, so November 47 until May 48, is basically a war between the Jewish and the Palestinian communities within Palestine. It's the Arab armies do not enter until May when the Zionist community, the Yishuv, declares the establishment of the state of Israel. And then that second phase goes from May until roughly July. In July, there's a pause in fighting. There's a truce, a kind of a temporary truce for about a month or two, in which they get the Zionist forces get the Czechoslovakian arms shipments. And then the final phase of the war, you could say August until November, December. So the first phase of the war is basically, I mean, you could call it a civil war, but you have these Palestinian paramilitary irregular forces led by people like Abdul Qadir al-Husseini. You have a number of these Palestinian militant groups, trying basically they're underfunded. They are given, they don't have weapons. They don't have military training or organization or supplies. Why is that? Because the entire leadership of the Palestinian Arab community, both military leadership, political leadership, was either imprisoned, killed, or exiled after the Great Revolt. So you basically don't have much of a Palestinian, paramilitary landscape to really speak of. So they're completely decimated by the British, 7-8 years earlier, whereas the Zionist forces were receiving training and funding and arms from the British themselves. In fact, during the Great Revolt of from 36 to 39, you have Zionist forces and British troops fighting side by side. Okay, against the Palestinian and natives. So, anyways, the Zionists have a huge military advantage over the Palestinians for those reasons, and so the Zionists are striking blow after blow. Like I said, in the very early, I'd say the first 2 months of the war, December, January, there were some victories, specifically Palestinian victories, military victories, specifically in their ability to basically cut off supply lines to Jerusalem. Because if you look at the Yishuv, the Zionist community in Palestine, and where they established communities, it's basically in the coastal plains and in the Galilee. So it's like kind of the coastal western plains and the Galilee, whereas Jerusalem is very much the mountainous interior, and there aren't very many Zionist communities to the west or around Jerusalem. It's that is kind of, but nevertheless, it is a very large Jewish community. So it's a large Jewish community, an important Jewish community, but it's not very well. There aren't very many other Jewish communities or neighborhoods or towns near it, and so it's kind of vulnerable, right?
Right.
So that you could say is the focus in the first few months. But shortly thereafter, the Zionists realized that in order for them to basically preserve their presence in Jerusalem, they need to completely dominate the interior of the country. And that is when they go on this military offensive, including the committing massacres in Deir Yassin, which I believe is April, if I'm not wrong.
April, yeah.
And they're committing all kinds of massacres in the interior of the country. They continue to do so in June and July after the establishment of the State of Israel. I believe the massacres in Ramla and Lid are I believe June and July, if I'm not wrong. And then the Arab armies invade, but the Arab armies are weak. They're uncoordinated. The Zionist leadership forms an alliance with Transjordan.
Abdullah.
Right,
Yeah,
right,
Abdullah,
right,
I was
right.
just about to bring that up because wasn't King Abdullah the leader of the Arab Legion at that time? And you have Jordan, I think, had the most formidable military of every country around there, but he's already secretly has the only reason he's even there is because he wants to control a bunch of the territory and have it annexed into Jordan. And he's like meeting with Golda Meir to like establish this. So it's like you have the ostensible like head of the Arab Legion who has like one of the most formidable militaries of the Arab nations, whose heart isn't even concerned with actually even fighting Israel or anything like that. He's actually making deals about like, when this all ends, I want the West Bank and things like that, right? Like, so it's like, how could you even say that they were actually under threat of
Ilan Pape like literally describes in the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine where they had like mock battles where like they weren't actually firing at each other. They were literally doing like, I guess the closest thing to an enactment of a battle, like a Civil War reenactment, without actually causing any casualties.
Yeah, I believe the book that deals with this is titled Collusion
Across. That's Avi Shlaim's first book.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Where he documents Golda Meir's secret passage across the Jordan River. She meets with King Abdullah of Jordan, and there's a secret agreement between the Zionist community and the Transjordanian state, the Transjordanian monarchy, to divvy up Palestine. These Transjordanian monarchy agrees not to attack the Zionists if the Zionists allow Transjordan to occupy the West Bank, which is exactly what happens. Of course, the King Abdullah of Jordan pays the ultimate price. He pays, for this usurpation of Palestinian rights. He is assassinated on the steps of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in 1950. We all kind of know how that turned out for him. But yeah, there's basically the secret agreement between Jordan and the Zionist community of Palestine. So that's not much of and of course the Arab Legion, which is basically this British military force that is under the control of a British military officer. His name is Glub Pasha. It's basically a kind of British military force that is kind of an alliance with the Zionist community. So, anyways, that's kind of the second phase in which the Arab armies invade. They're pushed off by Zionist forces, who now have weapons coming in from Czechoslovakia, who have the alliance with Transjordan, and who are very well funded and well organized. And then the third phase of the war is the Zionists decide, well, we need to make a final push. Into the south and into the north. And so their troops go south. They expel thousands of people from Beersheba, from Bersaba, and their forces push all the way down to Eilat. And then they go on a campaign in the north. These are military offenses, okay? These are not like defensive operations. These are military offensives to take over land, to establish the borders of the future state of Israel. And so they push, and then in the north, the expulsions are particularly aggressive. In the last 2 months of the war, October, November 1948, they expel hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from the north. And that is basically the way the war ends. By, I believe, end of November 48, the war is basically over, and you have armistice agreements signed between Israel and the surrounding Arab states in the coming months and years. And so that is kind of what I would say about the 1948 war.
And that actually leads me real perfectly into my next question here. We're talking about all this collusion between King Abdullah of Jordan. Thankfully I have a historian here that I can ask this question. Zach, this is confusing to me because I've always heard that every single surrounding nation around Israel was just incorrigibly hostile, hell-bent on the destruction of Israel, would stop at nothing to destroy Israel. You could make peace with no one, you could make alliances with no one, but you're saying they colluded with Jordan, and then
I thought these were anti-Semitic Arabs that wanted nothing but to exterminate.
Maybe talk to a little bit like in the conclusion of 1948, the like potential peacemaking process. I think you touched about this a little bit when you brought up Avi Shlaim's Iron Wall, where he discusses it, and then through reading Shlaim, I was also brought to this book, The Road Not Taken by Rabinovich, which talks about this kind of road of peace that may not have been taken after 1948, which I think is very much left out of like an Orthodox Zionist narrative of the war, right?
Yeah, that's exactly correct. In the couple of years after the 48 War, there were a number of attempts made by Syrian leaders to reach a peace deal with Israel. And there were like 3 or 4 of these Syrian leaders. I think one of them was named El Zaim.
Zaim, yeah.
Zaim. There were a few. There were multiple coups, so it's hard to keep track of all the leaders.
A lot going on in Syria at that time.
Not exactly a stable political
Right.
scene in Syria, but nevertheless, there were many overtures, and they were all consistently rejected by Zionist leaders. Ben-Gurion had no desire to make peace with the Arab states. The basic attitude of the Zionist community, if you had to paint like Israeli leaders with a very broad stroke from 48 to the present, it's the Iron Wall approach. It's build a stronger military, fortify the borders, but no peace. We're not interested in peace with the Arab neighbors at all. I mean, there was no interest, no desire whatsoever, because in all of these cases, peace required making concessions.
Land.
Right.
Land concessions. You have to give up land that you illegally occupied. And this became particularly true after 67 and 73, when it was very clear that Egyptian presidents, President Nasser and Sadat, were especially Sadat in the 70s and 80s, he was very interested in making peace with Israel, but there was no interest whatsoever on the Israeli side. And this is well documented in in Avi Shlam's book, The Iron Wall. So look, here we are, decades later, we have the same basic intransience. Things haven't really changed much, right? It was Israel had to be dragged to Oslo. There were multiple, Palestinians made so many overtures. Yasser Arafat renounces violence, recognizes the state of Israel in 1988, recognizes Israel as a Jewish state in 1988, and it's still 5 years before Israel signs this Oslo Accords. But Israel is basically dragged to the Oslo Accords, which even the Oslo Accords itself is they're not even really making any real concessions. I mean, now I'm opening up a can of worms, which we don't have to get into. But the same basic thing happens again in 2000 with Camp David. Is no real concessions. Israel doesn't actually give Palestinians real sovereignty. They don't actually propose any real resolution to the refugee issue. They're not interested in making concessions.
You want a Palestinian state? Best I can do is more settlements. All right, the best I got for you.
And then you see the same thing happening today with Netanyahu, where for months, I mean, since day one of the war, Hamas said, literally on October 9th, October 10th, all for all. There could have been, every single hostage could have been returned home within a few days of October 7th. There was no interest in that. And then over the past few months, we've seen these, negotiations, these hostage negotiations, ceasefire negotiations, in which Hamas has made their position unambiguously clear, crystal clear. All we want is a ceasefire, an end to the genocide, right? So stop slaughtering us, withdraw your forces to outside Gaza. And even that, they're willing they're actually negotiating that. They're willing to make concessions on that. But ultimately, there has to be a permanent ceasefire. That is the number one thing that no Israeli leader, not Netanyahu, not Benny Gantz, no Israeli leader is willing to agree to that. So here we are again, the same basic problem, Israeli intransience, Israeli inability to make any concessions at all.
Yeah, and I appreciate you giving the whole, like the totality of the history on that, which I'm less read up on than the early phases. But like even in Benny Morris's Border Wars, and honestly, when I listened to you speak in other interviews, I was like, I know he likes that book, because like you bring up the thing of like, where Benny Morris says like over 90% of them were unarmed. Like I could hear you like quoting like specific things from that book that I'm like, okay, I know that he's on the same level with me on that book. Not like on the same level. I mean, the level of interest, not like of education. That's all. I didn't want to make that seem otherwise. But it's interesting because we hear this narrative that there was no ability to make peace. They were completely incorrigible. They were nothing but hostile. They were just feverish for war. But if you read these books like Border Wars and Iron Wall, okay, so we have Abdullah, who was very willing to accept a Jewish state as long as he could have the other parts of Palestine for his nation. We know in Syria there was multiple, including this Zaim guy, who I believe was like, hey, if you give me money for infrastructure, I'll take, I think like 200,000 of the refugees and settle them here in Syria. Like it was like an amazing offer. And then even Nasser, who is like, made out to be during that time, like one of the most chief like belligerence against Israel, actually apparently sent secret overtures to speak with Zionists about like attempting to make peace and things like that. And I think Lebanon had very little to do with a lot of the fighting, during that. So it's like the whole narrative kind of gets, ripped to tatters if you actually are aware of those instances, correct? Well,
That's
you kind of already said it, but
yeah, that's exactly correct. Look, I think to really understand the Zionist-Israeli perspective from 40 to the present, you have to understand this underlying assumption that every Israeli leader has had, which is the only way we can secure our presence in this land is through force,
right?
Is through deterrence capacity,
Yeah.
is through violence. They are of the mentality and of the belief, and there's almost no exceptions to this, that our presence here is unwelcome. I mean, and they're right about it. And, this is the crazy thing. Like, they are aware. They know what they've just done. They're obviously aware that they've just expelled hundreds of thousands of people from their homes and prevented their return by force. And so they know this presence of a Jewish supremacist state in Palestine is extremely unwelcome, not just in Palestine, but in the surrounding region. And so based on that belief, they arrive at the conclusion, correct or incorrect, that there is no possible way to ever reconcile that. And so the only way for the Israeli state to survive is through strengthening our deterrence capacity, and indiscriminate use of force and disproportionate use of force. Hence the Dahiyya doctrine that Israel embraces in in Lebanon in the 2000s. And that doctrine is obviously alive and well, and we're seeing the consequences in Gaza today.
Which is essentially a doctrine of collective punishment, right? Like essentially like we'll make the civilian population hurt so badly that they can't continue the war.
I think that they're also not helping by every more progressive leader within Israel's history not even creating so much as like the idea that like we might allow some people to return.
Yeah, a just settlement to the refugee problem, which is like very ambiguous. It's like, hey, let's come to a negotiation about it, but that is even
it's like that's violence. That's violence to us. What you're saying is you're trying to replace us with Palestinians.
So just two more questions here for you. The next one is that I'm a huge fan of Avi Shlaim, as I think I've already said a couple times here. Shlaim has an extremely interesting perspective, being that he was born in Iraq and then immigrated to Israel when he was, I believe, 9 years old. Zionists very often evoke the ethnic cleansing of Arab Jews from Middle Eastern nations to deflate the moral culpability of the Nakba. Can you speak to the historic position of Jewish people within the Arab states?
Look, if you were a Jewish person and I asked you, would you rather live in Europe or in the Arab Middle East or even the Muslim Middle East, at any point in time from, let's say, the year 1500 to the present, I mean, or 1500 to 1947. I mean, the answer would be, well, if those are the only, if that's all I know, well, obviously I would rather be in an Arab country, because as a Jew in an Arab country, I fared much, much better off than as a Jew in Europe over the course of many, many, many centuries, from the Middle Ages, really all the way on down to the 1947, to the eve of the 1948 war. And Jews, again, we're speaking in broad strokes. I don't think any historian would disagree with that. Obviously, there were there were cases of Jewish persecution of Jews in Arab and Muslim lands, but as a general rule of thumb, they fared much better. They generally speaking were a protected community. The dhimmi, as it's known in Islam, was a protected status. Maybe they had to pay a jizya tax, but basically you had to, these people had a place. Islam respected their traditions. And this was, by the way, also true within Palestine itself, that the Jewish community of Palestine, the native Jews of Palestine, actually, we're part and parcel of the Ottoman tapestry. We're part and parcel of Ottoman Palestine. And you have many anecdotes, even, from Zionists themselves. One great example is Amos Oz, his grandfather. His father. He shares this anecdote in his memoir, where his father talks about how his father would be living in the old city of Jerusalem, and in the courtyard belonging to the group of houses in his particular neighborhood in the old city of Jerusalem, you'd have Muslim and Jewish children playing, and then you'd have fights between the Muslim and Jewish children of one courtyard fighting against the Muslim and Jewish children of another courtyard.
Right.
There were Jews and Muslims on both sides of the fight.
Right.
Even the idea that the major fault line within within Ottoman Palestine was Jewish, Muslim, Christian, even that is in and of itself a fiction and a fantasy. In fact, the fault lines, I would say, were much more so between socioeconomic classes, and especially between rural and urban Palestine. And that's the case of Palestine. But I would actually say that's the case in many other parts of the Arab world. The fault lines were not necessarily Jewish, Muslim, or Jewish, Christian. They were urban, rural. They were rich, poor, but they were not Jewish, Muslim. Jews and Muslims enjoyed a tremendous amount of harmony, and obviously in places like Baghdad, where 40% of Baghdad was Jewish. You had Jewish Iraqi politicians, Jewish Iraqi musicians, Jewish Iraqis played a critical role in Arab Iraqi culture. The same was true in Morocco. The same was true in Tunisia. The same was true in Egypt, right? You had Jewish communities well integrated around the Arab and Muslim world for centuries and centuries and centuries. And ask yourself, what happened? Why did that go?
What historical event happened to make all that different?
And no one is saying that there's any justification or legitimacy to the persecution.
You said it in the beginning. There's no such thing as good ethnic cleansing. Like, you know what I mean? Like, we've already talked, we started off with that in this conversation. So yeah, go ahead. And that's kind of what I was going to bring to you next, is that obviously we do see a reaction from the Arab states after 1948, after we see the persecution of Arabs or Palestinians, and after a lot of these countries receive a ton of refugees. You see it might, and I'm not saying this justifies it, like you're saying, a kind of tit for tat, like now a major rise in anti-Semitism and what ultimately could be considered in one sense ethnic cleansing. I think a lot of the other side of it was actually voluntary immigration because they wanted to go to Israel, but there certainly was also a degree of issues there. I wouldn't say that it was 100% voluntary, correct?
That's exactly correct. You have a wide range of cases, right? Because we're talking about 20, 21, 22 countries here. Right. You have Jews literally living in every single Arab and Muslim country, from Iran and Turkey to all of North Africa, to the Gulf, to Yemen and obviously Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. So you have Jewish, Jewish populations across the Muslim and Arab world. And there's an incredible amount of complexity in trying to boil down the status of, all these Jewish populations in all these countries to just a one-liner of they were all ethnically cleansed. Obviously, that's obliterating a tremendous amount of differences between these different countries. As a general rule of thumb, it was the case that, first of all, many of these populations were themselves Zionists. They supported the establishment of the State of Israel and actually wanted to move there. Right. In many cases, there were discriminatory laws passed that, I don't know if it's fair to say they were ethnically cleansed, but certainly they faced discrimination. And for that reason, they wanted to move to Israel. And then, of course, there were many cases in which they were, you could say, legitimately ethnically cleansed. The options were, we're going to either, we're going to confiscate your property. We're going to prevent you from, your means of livelihood. Well, in that case, I think it's pretty fair to say that these were cases of ethnic cleansing. Right. So it's correct to say that there's no single description of what happened to the Arab to the Jewish Arabs.
But is it also safe to say that we didn't, even these instances of extreme discrimination, which would ultimately kind of like culminate in what is effectively an ethnic cleansing, that these were very much responsive to the Zionist project being established? Like for Egypt, for example, I believe in Border Wars, Benny Morris states that after receiving a ton of refugees coming into Egypt, they kind of said like, well, here's some refugees of your own. And that doesn't justify anything, but we have to contextualize like how we got to this point where these things occurred. And that's just what I wanted to clear up with you, which I think you did masterfully. So this is the last question I have for you, the last official question. I have just a extra thing if we can get into it very briefly, but last question I have for you. And this is something I heard I think you brought it up on Katie Halper, and you definitely brought it up with Marcus. And honestly, I was perplexed how nobody asked you a follow-up question on this, but you speak about your time that you were a part of a group of Palestinian and Jewish researchers who went into the Balkans to engage in what you described as comparative conflict analysis between the conflicts of Israel-Palestine and the conflict in the Balkans. Now, you mentioned this as you were kind of talking about your evolution into becoming like an anti-Zionist, that like you were around Palestinian people, and it's like kind of part of that discussion. But like, no, I feel like nobody actually asked you the follow-up question. Like, Israel's currently being charged with genocide in the ICJ. Bosnia, the case in Bosnia is I believe the only one where there was actually a guilty charge made by the ICJ on the case of genocide. I can't help but be like, ask you, like, what did you learn during that time? What are the parallels? What are the differences between what's currently going on in Gaza versus what you were able to study while you were in the Balkans?
Thanks for asking about that. Yeah. It's a very interesting comparison. Like, there are obviously important differences, right? Israel is you could say, a settler colonial project, which is to say that you had a settler population, established presence in a land, and proceed to subject the native inhabitants to subjugation. That is not exactly what has happened in the Balkans, but there are some very interesting parallels, especially, I would say, with regard to what Serbia has done in Kosovo over the decades. So what you have is, Serbians claim Kosovo as part of their historic homeland. Oh, the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, right? Like, it is part of the historic Serbian homeland. Kind of the same way Israeli Jews might talk about how Judea and Samaria are part of the historic, Judean kingdoms
from 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, 700 years ago, 2,000 years ago, right? Same general kind of order of magnitude of time. And so for that reason, over the past many, many decades, there has been basically a Serbian, exactly what is happening in the West Bank is happening in Kosovo, where you have basically these Serbian little enclaves, settler populations that are, they have full rights in Serbia. They are Serbian. They hold Serbian passports. They have extra rights that the Albanian Kosovars in Kosovo do not have. And this process had been getting worse in the 70s and 80s, especially when Milosevic came to power. I believe in 1980 was it, where he started sending more and more Serbian settlers to basically take over Kosovo and try and create a demographic Serbian majority in Kosovo, and so this, I think, has very, very similar parallels to basically what Israel has done in the West Bank, specifically with regard to the Bosnian genocide in Srebrenica in 95 or 96. Here you have a situation which, Bosnia and Herzegovina is basically a country that is divided between Serbs, between Croats, and between Bosnians. You kind of have all three populations living intermixed. And what I would say happens here is, you could say, kind of the way that Israel arms and funds these settler militias. The same was happening, these settler militias who are carrying out acts of terrorism and vandalism and violence throughout the West Bank on a daily, actually I would say more hourly basis now. There's a settler attack almost on an hourly basis. The same was happening with Serbia and these Bosnian Serbs in places like Srebrenica in the 90s. So basically, Serbia is funding and supporting and arming these Serbian militias that are going around Bosnia and massacring Bosnian Muslims. And then there's one case in Srebrenica where they go in and they separate out the men and the women, and they line up all the men. I think it's like 7,000 or 8,000 Bosnian Muslim men are just lined up, and they're massacred. So so there are parallels there as well. But I would say, actually, the bigger story, I think, really is, and this is the lessons I would draw from the case of the Balkans, is that whenever you're trying to create an ethno-national state and you're subjecting certain you're giving certain ethnic populations more rights than others, which is exactly what Serbia did in Serbia and Kosovo, which is what various Bosnian states tried to do, which the Serbian Bosnians tried to do, what the Bosnian Muslims tried to do. It's also what the Croats tried to do in Croatia, to subject Bosnian Muslims and Serbs to second-class citizenship in Croatia. So wherever you went in the Balkans, you had these ethno-states trying to establish kind of ethnic supremacy of their ethnic group, the Croats in Croatia, the Bosnians in Bosnia, the Serbs in Serbia and Kosovo. It led to bloodshed. I mean, that's the underlying lesson, is that if you try to create an ethno-state and give one ethnic population more rights than others, it's going to lead to violence.
Right.
And that's almost a universal rule. Wherever you have ethno-states, wherever you try to say one ethno-national group, one ethno-religious group should have more rights than others, this will lead to bloodshed. It's almost a law or a nature of the universe. This is how the universe works. Violence breeds violence. If I punch you in the face, you're going to punch me back. If
I'll cower away. I'm just kidding.
If not me, my child will avenge me and punch you in the face later, or your children in the face later.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it strikes me as one of the almost one of the most universal laws, to the extent that you can even speak of universal laws. It is just always the case that when you perpetrate violence, if you dominate one group, you subject them to subjugate them, prevent them from being able to achieve their rights, then that will lead to blowback, and that is universal.
And I've heard you mention this, talking about and I'm sorry, I don't have this. This is like an additional question that I just thought of. But I've heard you in the previous things talk about the futility of this idea of making Hamas extinct, that you can just go in there and you can go into the Gaza Strip and somehow destroy radicalism with an iron fist, and that no more radicalism will be bred or continue or anything like that. And it's a pipe dream. And I've heard you mention this in previous things, but I just spent 6 weeks in Colombia, and in Colombia I did a lot of reading about FARC, and there's a lot of similarities between the Colombian state's campaign against FARC as a guerrilla group that for decades, there's been all these presidents of Colombia that had tried to be this strong arm person, I'm going to go out into the jungles and we're going to arm the civilians, we're going to bomb, we're going to fumigate, whatever we have to do to destroy FARC. Well, fast forward 50 years later, and in 2016 they have to sign a peace agreement with them because FARC never dies. They are only continues to be replaced, re-radicalized because of these iron fist scorched earth policies that they have. And it's I can't see a way in which I see a lot of parallels between that situation and what's currently, and think about the Taliban in Afghanistan. We said we were trying to destroy them for 2 decades, and then we ended up
and we got them, right? Mission accomplished. We did that, right?
They run the entire country now. So it's it seems how are these kind of larger powers, how can they not see the writing on the wall that you can't just eliminate radicalism in that way?
I mean, this idea that you can eradicate Hamas is absurd for at least 3 reasons. Number one is that, first of all, Hamas is not just a military wing.
Right.
It's also the government in Gaza, meaning it runs a power plant. Yeah. It runs the schools. It runs the mosques. It runs the transportation ministry. It runs the health ministry. Yeah. It runs the education ministry. It runs everything.
Yeah.
It polices the streets. It issues building permits, right? Hamas
takes out the trash.
But you're going to kill all the trash men, the garbage men, because they're all Hamas, right? You're going to kill all the schools, all the teachers and all the schools and all the preachers and all the mosques and all the bureaucrats who are issuing building permits and issuing, permits to fish in the sea and to grow tomatoes, right? Yeah. You're going to kill them all? You're going to kill tens of thousands of bureaucrats? And so that's one reason
Israel's yes, actually.
Right. We saw how this played out in Iraq with the Ba'athists, anybody who was associated with the Ba'athist party, which if you were to have any part to do with any part of the government, you were involved in the Ba'athist party, whether you agreed with them or not, whether you liked them or not. And when you made this blanket rule of anybody that was associated with the former government, you're gone, right? The whole country fell into disarray.
Well, and this is with the UNRWA thing. Israel will be per our intelligence, there's a number of UNRWA employees that have connections with Hamas. And it's what is a connection with Hamas? Like you said, they're the governmental institution of the entire place. When they always say it's the Gaza-run health ministry, the Hamas-run Gaza health ministry, and we can't trust anything they say. And it's
his lunch lady in the cafeteria was associated with Hamas. Hamas.
You can literally make a flimsy association with probably almost every Gazan citizen with Hamas and paint them as a militant to the Western media.
That's exactly correct. So that's at the first level why it's just an absurd argument or idea or belief that you could actually eradicate them. I think the second reason it's absurd is because if you look back at Palestinian militant resistance, it always takes on new forms and comes about in new places to attack new targets whenever Israel eradicates the previous version of Palestinian militant resistance. This first happened in the 50s when Israel tried to root out and eradicate militant resistance coming out of Gaza. Guess what? It just relocated to the West Bank. And then, by the way, Yasser Arafat himself was one of those commandos carrying out cross-border raids in the 50s from Gaza. Well, guess what? They pushed him out of Gaza, and what happened? That gave birth to Fatah, which was founded in 1959. That became Israel's most formidable military foe for the next 4 decades. And then what happened, in their desire to, eradicate the PLO in Lebanon in 1982, they went in, we're going to eradicate Palestinian militant resistance from Beirut. Well, guess what? They slaughtered...
also commit the Sabra and Shatila massacre at that time as well. Yeah.
Will massacre thousands, will allow Phalangist militias to enter Palestinian refugee camps in the suburbs of Beirut, slaughter thousands of Palestinians, and then guess what? We'll occupy South Lebanon for 20 years, and then realize that that's not working either. And then when we leave, we gave rise to Israel's most formidable military foe today, which is Hezbollah. Okay, so and then of course it didn't eradicate the PLO. They just relocated to Tunisia. And then in their attempt to sort of undermine and undercut the PLO, they ended up supporting Al-Mujama' al-Islami in the 1980s, which is the organization that evolved into, guess who? Hamas. And now what'll happen is, if I had to predict the future, looking out 5-10 years, they're going to eventually come to a ceasefire agreement with Hamas. Hamas maybe at some point will become a non-factor, but instead you'll get new militant groups. You'll get the Lions Den, based in Nablus. You'll get the Jenin's Brigade, based in Jenin. And by the way, you have Palestinian militant resistance, not just in Nablus and Jenin, but in every single town and city across the West Bank and actually across Gaza as well. There are 10 different armed groups in Gaza. It's not just Hamas. It's not just Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You have 10 different groups. And then if you eradicate them, there'll be new ones. They'll attack from Lebanon. They'll attack from Egypt. They'll attack from Jordan. But you cannot, because here's the basic problem. It's an idea. You can't kill an idea. The idea is pretty simple. We didn't lose the right to equality or to live in Palestine just because we were violently ethnically cleansed from it. That is a very powerful idea. I do not lose my right to live in Palestine just because I'm violently ethnically cleansed from it. I do not lose the right to have freedom of movement and to vote for the country and the government that controls my life just because I was occupied in 1967. No, I didn't lose that right. I still have that right, and I always will have that right. And that is the fundamental problem with Israel's idea that they're going to eradicate violent resistance.
I think that right there, that final statement is where we can leave this discussion. I've already feel like I've abused your time in a very gross way. I do have one last follow-up question though, and that's because we are a literature-centered stream. Everything that we do, it kind of just has is based on books that we've read and analyzed and things like that. So I have to ask you, what book recommendations would you give to our audience or ourselves if they want to learn about this conflict?
Wow, I mean, there's so much incredible literature that we've talked about a lot of great books.
I know, maybe top 5. Give me your top 5.
I think we brought up 10 different books in this hour.
Maybe I can just mention a few perhaps less well-known books, at least ones we haven't talked about already on this stream.
Right. I'm going to type these for my own personal.
So the one I mentioned briefly in passing, but I highly recommend everyone read this book cover to cover. Noor Masal has a book on, I believe, what was the title? It's published in 1992 by Palestine Institute Studies, where he's reviewing the history of the Zionist concept of transfer. That is a must read for anyone who's interested in the history of Israel-Palestine. I would recommend Rashid Khaledi's books. I think they're more approachable. He has there's multiple books he's written over the years. Right. The one I think that's best suited for popular audiences is the one he published. What was the title? We could pull it up here. 100 Years War. Thank you. I would
Iron Cage.
Great book. I would also recommend a very recent book that was just published by Ilan Pape, actually, called, I think it's called Lobbying on Both Sides of the Atlantic.
Yes.
I think I have a copy. Oh, no, it's not right here. But great book. It's a history of kind of the history of kind of Zionist lobbying in both the United States and Great Britain. On that note as well, I think The Israel Lobby is just a classic book by John Mearsheimer. And what was his co-author's name? Stephen Walt, I believe. Nura Erekat has written a great book on Palestine and the law. If you're interested, I mean, Norman Finkelstein's books, my God, like all his books on Gaza. He's written a book. He wrote a book just on, I believe it was the Mavi Marmara case. Yeah, he has like 3 or 4 books on Gaza. Read them all. No one is more serious when it comes to documentation and evidence and facts than Norman Finkelstein.
Dude,
the guy
if you read this book, like half of certain pages are all footnotes. Like if you actually read it, like sometimes it's like, look, this is in entirety the footnote of this page. It's like some of the pages are more footnotes than they are his writing. It's so extensively documented.
Yeah, maybe we'll pause there. That's at least 4 or 5 books I just rattled off. So,
Zach, do you have any like plugs or anything like where people can follow you, what they can do to like stay in tune with what you're doing, any projects that are coming out that you'd like to let everybody know about?
Yeah, so I have a newsletter. You can subscribe to that newsletter at PalestineNexus.com. I also teach a course, a kind of an Israel-Palestine 101 course that I offer. You can go. It's like 5+ hours of just me talking and then answering questions, kind of like this, but much more structured and much more systematic. And so you can go to PalestineNexus.com/courses. You'll see it. It's in the header. You can take that course and stay tuned. If you subscribe to my newsletter, you'll hear about a new course that I'm offering. I don't have the details yet. I can't tell you the name of that course yet, but if you subscribe to my newsletter, you will get alerted when that course is announced, hopefully in the next month or 2. So stay tuned with regard to the new course. I will zoom in on one particular period in kind of Palestine-Israel history that I think is especially important. Rather than kind of a survey, 1870 to the present, it will be a much more focused. Maybe we'll do 48. Maybe we will do 67 to the present. Maybe we'll do the peace process from 93 to the present. Maybe we'll do just the post 2007 period. So we're going to zoom in on one or another periods and do 5 hours of content just on that period.
Yeah, you're speaking our language right now with all that stuff. And before we go, I just want to extend our deepest gratitude to you because, you were interviewed by Marcus and I looked, you're doing the Katie Halper show, you're doing the Majority Report, you're doing Owen Jones. And, we're just so much smaller than all of those things. Like you probably could be right now talking to someone with a much larger platform than we have. But I do think what we don't have in audience and size, we make up for in enthusiasm and an actual dedication to the subject matter. So I just want to say how much how awesome it is that you came on here and decided to talk to us like that, despite us being very small.
Don't be so self-deprecating. You've asked better questions than almost any other podcast host or interviewer that I've ever been on. So really kudos to you guys. Thanks for giving me a space to talk about history and to raise all of these issues. You guys are doing great work. So kudos to you and thanks again for having me.
You hear that, Katie Halper? No, I'm just kidding.
You hear that?
You don't run around here trying to make friends with somebody who's depriving you of your rights. They're not your friends. No, they're your enemies. And treat them like that and fight them. And you'll get your freedom. My repertoire is USSR. Be a low style. Be a low style. Got thrown out the car. Guys with subversive plots. They'll call you an extremist or a subversive or a red radical. Guys with subversive plots. Red radical. And fight them. Capitalism and democracy. Capitalism and democracy are not synonymous. We do this up like ants in a colony.